Have you ever wondered what happens when two real swords actually clash together? Well, so have I. And in today's video, I wanted to find an answer to this question. You see, in movies and pop culture, we see swords clash all the time, but that's not real life. Do they chip? Do they deform? Ooh, maybe they friction weld. Maybe not that last one. But join me on today's video as we put these things to the test.
We're what you call professionals.
Swords. I love swords. Chances are if you're watching this video, you like swords too. Here at Shadiversity, we use them in pretty much every video. We have sharp swords, blunt swords, alloy swords, training swords, LARP swords, all the different types of swords. But it's not just that, we've actually made our own swords. Things like the falchion, the carbon fiber, the giant sword, the fire swords. So many swords. But it's not just us. Things like movies, TV shows, pop culture, anime, you name it. Swords have been, and still kind of are, everywhere. Ever since I was a child, I've always wondered what actually happens when two real swords clash together, like they do in the movies. We see, movies aren't actually real life. In the movies, for safety reasons, they have to use things like alloy or aluminum swords, like this one. They're called stage swords. They're incredibly light, they can't actually cut you, and they don't really hurt too much if they were to hit you. It's for safety reasons, obviously. But real swords with a reeled edge are a completely different beast. First off, they are heat-treated tempered steel. So if I was to hypothesize what's actually going to happen to the edge, it's definitely going to chip, maybe deform. And I'm not really sure after that. That's why I wanted to test it in today's video. But while we're on the subject of it, for today's video, why don't we come up with a simple working definition of what an edge is? First off, I would define an edge as two planes of a sword coming to an abrupt end. Simple and sweet. But while we're defining edges, why don't we actually define all the other parts of the sword? So just so we're all on the same page, let's go through some of the terminology of swords. First off, we have the pommel. This acts as a counterbalance to the sword. Then we have things like the handle and the crossguard. Then moving up, we have the fuller and the bevel. Now the bevel and the edge are two different things, but we'll get to that later. Now the bevel, first off, reduces the sword's weight while also making it easier to cut things apart. Now the bevel can come in lots of different shapes and sizes, or different grinds, should I say, things like concave or convex. But then we finally get to the edge, the bit that does all the cutting. Now, when it comes to the edge, different swords have different edge sizes. Take, for example, the katana, a beautiful sword in its own right, one of my favorites in fact. However, because of its aggressive bevel with a rather small edge, at least comparatively to its European equivalents, it actually makes it a really good cutter. However, it also has a tendency to be brittle along the edge. Why is that? Well, it's because the katana has a differential heat treating process, meaning a softer spine with a harder edge. Now, harder edges have greater internal stresses, making them a little bit brittle. However, when we come to something like a European sword, they have a different heat treating and tempering process, meaning different properties that make up the steel. So the edge should react differently when it's struck. If this one chips, well, what happens to this one? Well, I talk about swords all day, but at some point, I just got to test it. So I've just gotten back from the armory to decide upon today's test subject, and I thought this sword here was the perfect candidate. This is a Master Sword replica. We did a review on this sword a little while ago, and ever since then I've had some issues with it. Not with the blade, but with the handle. It seems to be a handle of diminishing returns, meaning the more we use it, the worse it gets. However, for today's purposes, it's actually kind of perfect. First off, the edge is completely untouched on both sides, meaning every single strike will be able to see the exact damage that is dealt to the blade. Next up, the steel. The steel is actually not too bad. It's 1070 high carbon steel. Then we move on to the most important part, the edge. The edge is completely sharp on this. It's actually one of the sharpest swords we have here. So it actually makes it perfect for today's video, and I get to destroy it. How fun. But then we should talk about the sword that I'm going to be smacking against it. And here I have one of those zombie swords, basically just a hunk of steel. It doesn't really matter too much about this particular sword as long as it has a sharpened edge, which it does. But back to this one, I wanted to talk about how I'm going to be testing it. First off, we have two different edges, meaning two different sides. On one side, I want to test it against static targets, meaning bracing the sword down and chopping down into it. And then on the other side, I actually want to test it in a bit more of a realistic dueling sense, as safely as possible, of course. But to do that, I'm going to get someone's help. Let's go meet him now.
It's taking him so long. It's had to be here at midday.
Nate,
Hey, Tyrant, you took your while. Why do you want a decommissioned sword, and why do you have a decommissioned sword?
So, Nate, we've done some dumb things.
Oh, yeah, like that time with the fire swords?
At night time.
Yeah, full speed.
At each other's heads.
Yeah.
Yes, we've done some dumb things.
Yes.
And you know me, I'm curious in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And there's something I really wanted to test today. And that is, what happens if we swung a real sharp sword at each other?
I mean, that's the Zelda sword. That is
the Zelda sword.
Pretty sharp.
It's very sharp. We'll add a clip in so you guys can see, but this thing is no joke.
That's sharp. You ever heard that thing about cats and curiosity and...
Nah, I don't know what you're talking about. Okay. So I thought you would be fantastic to help me out. Discover what happens when we actually swing live, sharp blades at each other. Take, for example, Hollywood. Something like a bind or one of the clashes where they're like this for a long time.
That is true. That is true. And historically, blades do bite, and there are techniques around what happens with the bite. But I've got to say, it's not really done in HEMA as much as what it is with rounded edges. So,
a round edge simply slides down one another. For example, if we're trying to catch a blade in the crossguard,
it just slides.
It slides.
Yeah.
With an edge, well, what happened? So just so everybody's clear, we're not actually going to be trying to fight each other with sharp swords. We're more going to be simulating fighting, but what we're really looking for is what actually happens to the edge.
To the blades.
And how it feels in our hand, because I feel like this is going to feel a lot different to something like a blunt sword.
That is true. That is true. All right, let's give this a shot.
So, you may have noticed that I've put two different colored tapes on the crossguard, and the reason I've done this is, well, A and B testing. We have the yellow side, which will be our A side, and the red side, that will be our B side. With Nate, we're going to use the yellow side, so the A side of the sword. Let's put it to the test.
Kind of biting and bouncing out.
Yeah.
Yep.
Down.
Yep. Better.
Oh.
That felt really bad.
It did, didn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Nate. I've enjoyed swinging this very sharp sword at you.
Yeah.
I didn't enjoy the sword too much, but now I think it's time we get on to the B-side testing.
I'll leave you to it.
Let's see how this sword goes with that. We've finished up our A-side testing, our yellow side testing, and the results were quite interesting, which we'll get into a bit later. But before we do that, it's time to finish up with our B-side testing, the red side. This side is completely still untouched. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a zombie tool sword, this one here, which is the hunk of steel we used before. And I'm going to strike down upon this sword, or the edge to be more specific. But before I do that, I'll also need some safety equipment, like safety glasses, like these ones. So let's get started. That's a lot of damage. But that concludes our B-side or red side testing. I think we should go and talk about the results because they've been pretty interesting and I've had some things happen that I didn't expect. So let's go. I've finished up the testing for today's video, and before we get into the results, there's a couple of caveats that I have to mention. First off, none of these are meant to be taken as like a historical, example. These swords are made out of more modern steels, and they both kind of occupy the extremes of both ends. We have a low quality and a higher quality.
Well, I mean, if anything though, you would expect historical swords to have performed even worse. And look, we do it too. I think it's good to compare best of the best because when you find the highest quality historical swords made in the West and the East and the South, all that stuff, It's amazing.
Yeah.
But the truth is, the average sword that most of the average soldier had in Europe, in Japan, in the Middle East, and everything, was not great
best.
steel.
Yes.
It was steel. It was functional.
Yes.
And they broke.
Now, to go over today's results, first off, the yellow side was our A side test. Now, this was simulating combat, meaning it was a bit more free form, our arms have a little bit more give, things like that. But then when we get to the red side, it was static. It was chopping straight down on that steel just to see what would happen. Now, to be honest, I'm very surprised by the results on both examples. Now, on this higher grade of steel, 1070 high carbon steel, it held up like a beast.
I mean, I can see that, like in comparison,
Yes,
this looks like a hacksaw.
it does. Now, this is just made out of a hunk of steel, basically, and we took chunks out of it. Now, when it comes to this one, something to note is if you actually look at some of these chips, there's bluing around them.
Oh, wow.
There was a lot of heat generated from those sword blades.
Localized, really condensed heat.
Yes, very condensed. Now, this is fascinating to me because when you see like a sword fight in a movie, right, you think to yourself, well, what's going to actually happen to those swords? If people, like in Pirates of the Caribbean, when they're sitting there fighting, well, what happens? To be honest, it's actually more plausible than I thought. I thought it would be a bit more like this, but this sort of result isn't too surprising either.
If it's a good, strong sword,
Exactly.
that's kind of the key. And it also depends on period. Like, if you go to the Viking period, there were some really high-quality swords, like the Ulfbert sword. Most of them, though, were actually low-grade steel, and you would see damage like this if you're hitting the edge all the time.
Now, something that I also wanted to test was, you know how in a fight where they swing and then they bite into each other and they're kind of in a grip like this? It basically just chops the edge off and slides straight into the guard every single time. Now, this is important to note because when we train with a sword, we're training with blunts.
Yes.
So there's nothing really to bite on, so it's always sliding. It's basically the same story.
That is interesting because the assumption is they will bite and kind of stick when you're saying that's only happens a little bit.
Like maybe, but most of the time, as soon as you hit a strike, it will just shave the edge off and slide straight into.
You know
the
why
guard.
I think that's happening? Because I don't think people are acknowledging the bounce.
Yeah.
When there's a clash, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So even if it bites, most times it ought to get knocked out of that kind of lodging thing and then start to slide.
Even when you look at some of these larger gouges, and there's some pretty big ones in there, not a single time, I thought we'd maybe get it once, where the sword would get stuck. Didn't happen once. Every single time, even these larger gouges, it just went in, came straight out. So I was expecting a little bit more biting. I was expecting a little bit more, because you see it all the time. You see swords and they clash and then they sit there in the hole.
That's not because of the bite. They just think that's the cool thing to do.
It's the dramaticization of it. Yes, I get it. But it doesn't really happen. So I've learned...
Dramaticization? Dramatization.
Whatever. Dramaticization.
Look, the reason why because people in the comments would point it out.
Dramaticization, that's the word.
I'm jumping on them before they do it.
But from those couple of tests that we've done, it's very fascinating because we've never really done anything like this.
Few people want to sacrifice their swords, but we're in a fortunate enough position that we get sent swords for review. After the review, sometimes they're not usable.
And it's a question that I've had for a long time because in every single movie with a sword, people are sword fighting. And is it realistic? Well, kind of. Your sword will kind of hold up.
If it's good steel, and then if it's like magic steel,
then it's fine. It's fine. But even then, we have two comparable swords here, one on a lower end and one on a higher end, and I'm kind of impressed with both of them.
Like, really? Now, people might be wondering, hang on, magic steel doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist, yes.
Doesn't it?
Well, if you're wondering...
We got a video right here where I actually think we find magic steel, and that, I reckon...
would go up against this?
Even that.
Yeah.
Even that.
Video's right there. Check it out, guys. Thanks for watching. See you in another video. Bye-bye.